Nostradamus was perhaps the most celebrated seer of all time. His foretelling and his prophecy was done by what he called astronomical affections. It has been said that many of the prophecies of Nostradamus are so obscure they could mean anything or nothing. But when carefully studied, they do mean something. In his book, Prophecies, we find facts and indications that relate unmistakably to the events they foreshadow. And of course, obscurity itself was fashionable in the 1500s, and a necessity for seers. A time when forecasting disaster could often mean disaster for themselves. Nostradamus dared not be too outspoken too often. When he felt it advisable, he wrapped up his meanings in symbolism. And so, unlike many gifted but less diplomatic prophets, he died in his bed of natural causes in 1566. His name was Michel de Nostradame. He was of Jewish blood, but his parents became Catholic, and he professed that faith all of his life. When he was a small boy, he went to live with his mother's father, Jean de Saint-Remy, a learned and scientifically minded man who taught his grandson Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and the use of the astrolabe. The old man was a skilled herbalist and physician, and he trained Michel in the preparation of medicines and ointments and the virtues of herbs. Even then, Michel was more interested in the stars than in anything else, no doubt, since in those days medicine and magic were closely related, and he would learn how to calculate the right astrologic moment for the gathering of herbs. Michel was sent to Avignon as soon as he was old enough. From there he went on to Montpellier, which had the best school of medicine in France, perhaps the best in Europe. He wished to become a doctor. He took his final medical degree on October 23, 1529, having already made a great reputation through his treatment and successful cure of the plague which had ravaged Provence for 4 years. But all his skill could not save his wife and their 2 sons. Within a few years of the marriage, in the small town of Agen, she and the boys died in an outbreak of plague. For 8 years after his loss, Nostradamus was unable to settle in one place. He wandered through France, Italy, and Corsica. As if his sorrow was a catalyst of his inner development, now his clairvoyant gifts began to show themselves. He did not wish to incur the adverse attention he would risk if he became known as a prophet, yet he could not help making predictions. As these were fulfilled, more and more people believed him to have the gift of foretelling the future. When passing through Lorraine, France, he stayed with the Signor de Florenville, who was not a believer. To prove the foolishness, he pointed out to Michel a black and white suckling pig in the farmyard. "Foretell their future," he said. Michel told him that the Signor will eat the black one and a wolf will eat the white one. To make sure the prophecy was not fulfilled, the Signor presently told his cook to kill and serve the white pig for supper that night. The piglet having been killed, it was cooked and left on the table ready for dressing. While the cook was out of the kitchen, a wolf cub got in and ate the pig. It was a wolf cub that some of the servants were trying to tame. As all roasted pigs have the same color, the cook killed the black one and served it at supper that night. The Signor, no doubt, took some pleasure in telling his guest that they were eating the white pig. When Michel insisted that it was the black pig, the cook was sent for to prove Michel was wrong. The cook confessed that the white pig had been the wolf cub's meal, and the pork they had been eating was in fact the black pig. While Nostradamus was in Italy, he saw a young monk walking along the road toward him. He knelt in the dust before the monk, named Felice Peretti. Peretti was born of poor parents in a nearby village and had worked as a swineherd before he entered the church. Michel's comment was, "I kneel before His Holiness," and this comment was treated as a joke by those who heard it. But it was remembered later when Peretti was made cardinal, and then elevated to the papacy as Pope Sixtus V. In 1547, Michel finally settled in Cologne, practicing as a physician, but giving more time to astrology and metaphysics than to medicine. It was a year which was a milestone in his life. He married again, November 11, and began to compose his prophecies, which, when complete, spanned 7 millennia. The first edition was published in 1555. Its original title, Centuries, was bald and simple, but the contents were neither. In the preface, Nostradamus says he had decided to show by abstruse and twisted sentences, so as not to scandalize the public's fragile hearing. And I'll write down everything under a figure cloudy, rather than plainly prophetic. He knew very well the occupational hazards of a prophet's life in his day. He therefore wrote his predictions in a form which would yield little or nothing to cursory reading. The long and careful study necessary for their decoding protected their meaning from discovery except by the understanding few. He gives dates which proved correct for some of the events he foretells. He claims that he could give exact years in all his quatrains, but if he had done so, he would have been accused of being in league with the devil, which would have produced unpleasant repercussions for him. After publication of the second edition of Centuries, he was summoned to court by King Henry II, almost certainly because the prophet's fame had reached Queen Catherine, known as Catherine de' Medici. She had a mania for occultism, and would not have been satisfied until she had seen the man whose predictions all of France was talking about. Michel arrived August 15 of 1556, a striking figure in his long gown and square cap, the uniform of a doctor. He seems to have made a deep impression on Catherine. He was given the VIP treatment. Courtiers and their wives and daughters also arrived, and they paid handsomely for his advice. Horoscopes, cosmetic recipes, and prescriptions for gout and kidney stones or gallstones. He was the talk of the town. Dealing with Catherine was a different matter. She had asked him to tell her what was ahead for her children. He had to find some formula which would satisfy her that he had told her the whole truth, although in fact he dared not do so. Already in his book Centuries, he had accurately told their stories. Francois, the 13-year-old, would be married to Mary Stuart, and live with little happiness and die after reigning as king for 1 year. His 11-year-old sister Elizabeth would be the child wife of old King Philip of Spain and would also die young. The younger girl, Claudette, who was then only 9, would marry the Duc de Lorraine and live only into her 20s. 6-year-old Charles would be the 9th French king of his name. His reign would be darkened by the terrors of the Huguenot massacres. 2 crowns waited for the 5-year-old brother Henry, who in both kingdoms would be unhappy. His end would be assassination. The youngest girl, Marguerite, would be the wife of Henry of Navarre and become queen until he discarded her because of her adulteries. And the baby of the family, 2-year-old Hercule, who would be renamed Francis, would become Duc d'Anjou and ruler of the Netherlands. He would be treated as a figure of fun in every European court. He would be Elizabeth of England's little frog, whom she allowed to be her suitor for reasons of statecraft. How could Michel pass on his knowledge of wholesale tragedy to Catherine herself? Out of humanity he could not. Out of expediency he dared not. But there was one element in the future of her sons about which he could speak without causing grief to Catherine or endanger himself. He told her, "They will all be kings." He did prophesy the death of the Queen's husband, Henri, by saying, "The young lion shall overcome the old, in a warlike field, in single fight. In a golden cage he will pierce the eye. 2 wounds, 1, then die a cruel death, Just 3 years later, a tournament was held in Paris celebrating a double wedding. The king's daughter Elizabeth marrying old Philip II of Spain, and Marguerite marrying the future King Henry IV, Henry of Navarre, just as foretold. The tournament list had been drawn up, and the king rode against the captain of the Scottish Guard, Montgomery. In the third encounter, the jagged point of a splintered lance pierced the king's visor, which was gilded, and, as was the fashion of jousting helms shaped like a cage, it entered his eye, and a splinter also injured his throat, making 2 wounds 1. 10 days later, the king died. Michel had already written of Montgomery, the dueling captain, in his book, saying, "He who fights on a martial field, and shall have carried off the prize from one greater than he, shall be surprised by 6 men at night, naked and without armor, suddenly." 15 years later, Catherine's vengeance caught up with Montgomery, and he was arrested by 6 noblemen of the royal army while in bed. He was naked, as was customary. As if it were a spool of film, the future unrolled before Nostradamus. He foresaw and predicted nearly every major event in France, and many crises in other countries, from the 1500s all the way to the 20th century and beyond. The French Revolution is the theme of many quatrains. He referred to it as the advent of the Commons, or the rise of the Third Estate. He said the revolution would cause the topography of France to be arbitrarily altered, as it was when the ancient provincial divisions of France changed into departments with new names. He said the tombs of the French kings would be desecrated, which came to pass. And he said philosophy would replace religion at this time, which it did, when the teachings of Voltaire began to supersede Christianity. Nostradamus covered the full course of the revolution in his quatrains, predicting the execution of Louis XVI, and that his body would be covered with a powder that burns. The body was thrown into a pit and covered with quicklime. He gave the correct date of a treaty between Persia and Turkey. He foretold the union of the English and the Scottish crowns, predicted the Great Fire of London and the plague of Northern Europe. He saw the rise of Napoleon, even describing him with short hair, which was unusual for his time. He described Napoleon's final days among people of strange customs and strange language on a chalky island in the sea. You'll find many more such examples by reading Michel's works. His description of the leader of what he called the Great Germanies showed his accuracy on the 20th century, saying this new leader would give help that was counterfeit and would take over countries by offering them protection. He said France would be divided into 2 parts, and he describes bombing raids by saying living fire and death hidden in globes, will be loosed. Horrible, terrible. By night, enemy forces will reduce cities to powder. The disciple of Nostradamus, Jean-Aimé de Chauvigny, said that the predictions were not all done with astrology. Michel also made prophecies when he was in a state of ecstasy or trance. Michel also foretold the date of his own death and its manner. On returning from an embassy, he said, "The king's gift safely placed, I shall do no more. I shall have gone to God. By my relations, friends, and brothers I shall be found dead, near my bed and the bench." In June of 1566, Michel fell ill with gout and with dropsy. He said, "My end is near." He sent for a priest and gave confession, saying, "You will not see me alive at sunrise." The next morning he was found dead, as he had predicted, between the bench and the bed.